Greetings, YouTube. This is Rhett with Rolling Forward. And I left off last time speaking about why am I posting this stuff and who the heck am I? Well, again, I don't consider myself any kind of particularly outstanding or different person than hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of other quadriplegics rolling around America today. And ultimately, I think not much different than millions and millions of modern Americans moving through our world. I'm moving through our world in a wheelchair, and most of you are not. But again, I want to give you guys, some disabled presumably, and some non-disabled presumably, a little bit of background about the social presence of people with disabilities in society today. Well, it's 2021 right now. It's early spring, and were you today to go down to a average size or big mall, there'd be thousands and thousands of shoppers, and very likely you will encounter several people, at least, who are utilizing wheelchairs, both manual, non-motorized, and motorized, powered electric wheelchairs. You would encounter multiple people using wheelchairs, whereas even back 50 years, when I was newly disabled, I was injured in 1968. If I were to go to the mall in 1970, odds are I would be the only person there in a wheelchair on any given day. Not always, but usually. There were many fewer people with disabilities, people using wheelchairs, fewer of those people on the street in the middle of life 50 years ago than there are today. That's the same trend that you would find going back earlier in time, and let's say pre-World War II. Pre-World War II, people who were born with a disability, had a congenital disability, were often kept at home, kept in the back room, represented shame for the family, embarrassment for the family, were often basically hidden away by the family to eliminate the black mark on that family, and were simply ignored and not talked about. Not always, of course, but much of the time. And there were very, very few people in wheelchairs out in public and on the streets. Now, people have been breaking their necks and breaking their backs since there were people. I'm sure there were cavemen who broke their neck, but without fairly good quality medical care, a spinal cord injury resulted in death in fairly short order. And even through the 1930s, in the modern world, most people with a spinal cord injury died within months of incurring the injury, and the deaths were most often the result of infection. With a spinal cord injury comes a propensity to develop lung infections, pneumonia, or kidney and bladder infections, and prior to and even shortly after the discovery of penicillin in 1928, these infections killed people. Um, they killed not only non-disabled people, but members of the general population uh, often died from pneumonia at a much higher rate than today. Um, and so the disabled population uh, prior to uh, World War II as a good benchmark event. Prior to that time, um, people with disabilities were comprised primarily of people with with disabilities incurred at birth for any of many reasons, and the number of spinal cord injured people in that population was relatively small because generally they died off. The medical skills, medical drugs, and equipment were more primitive, and even in the best of environments, if an infection occurred, which was almost inevitable, death would follow. World War II, coming a decade or so after the discovery of penicillin, led to large numbers of veterans returning home from World War II with a spinal cord injury. One, they had access immediately to the best medical care that America could provide and the Western world. And the population was composed of young men who had been active, many exceedingly active, active enough to run around a battlefield and win a war. And when they came back, many more of them survived beyond an initial period of weeks or months because there was penicillin to treat infection and there was medical care provided quickly enough to save them from an initial set of pressure sores, which we still have not discussed in detail, and we will. But this population then began to comprise a much larger segment of the disabled population, and this segment was much more likely to go out in public after becoming disabled, to live long enough to do that, and to be dissatisfied with the function of society at that time. If there were steps up to a movie theater prior to World War II, the non-disabled population didn't care. The number of people in wheelchairs going to the theater pre-World War II was quite small, and the population of the disabled segment of our society prior to World War II was much more likely to simply accept the way things were. They were raised from childhood with a disability. Often, the families involved socialized that person to remain somewhat childlike and place few demands upon them. Now, this is a vast simplification and broad stroke of what was going on, but even to this day, too many families raise a child with a disability in a manner that renders them socially undeveloped, with a much reduced chance to be successful in their adult life Uh, and this is probably going to offend many people, and I say this not in order to offend, but merely a statement of my observations. However, I do think it is true. And so you have a suddenly larger number of people with disabilities who are much more demanding than prior populations of disabled people, because these returning veterans were not going to put up with being excluded. They were going to demand, and this trend was, uh, greatly increased during and after Vietnam, as there were, more and more injuries that survived long term due to continued improvement in the medical world, in the number and quality of antibiotics available, and in the quality of care for people who incur a spinal cord injury. So this was a big change in the culture of the disabled community, and a big change in the general culture, because now if uh, you, as a non-disabled person, went shopping, went out in public, lived your life, you were much more likely to at least see someone in a wheelchair than in prior decades. And this was a significant change. And those people that you did see were much more likely to not accept the fact that the movie theater had steps. They're going to demand, and they're going to become more publicly prominent in their demands to be allowed to re-enter the society that the population uh, just risked their lives to maintain, as a matter of fact. This was a big change, and I think I'll wrap this segment up at this time. Um, there'll be more to follow. I hope guided by your response, comments, questions, and input and feedback. And so, um, this is Rhett saying, um, it was nice to speak with you. I hope I do again. Um, please click subscribe and like, and YouTube. Ciao.